So there's been quite a few updates in regards to Russia and Ukraine. President Biden came out and gave a speech on it. I'm going to show you a little clip of that speech in a second. Now, I recommend you go and watch the entire speech because I really think he covers all of his bases. Like, he sort of gives every single opinion at once. I mean, it's kind of contradictory in some sense, but I'm going to show you the part that I found most interesting. But to me, the bigger angle in this story is actually not what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. It's the 1,001 ways that U.S. media has shit the bed and jumped the shark while attempting to cover this. Honestly, it's some of the worst coverage I've ever seen in my life. They've been demonstrably wrong, verifiably and provably wrong at a number of different times. And of course, there's been no accountability for it because there never is for mainstream media organizations. So first, like I said, let's jump to the Biden clip.
The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well. We're not targeting the people of Russia. We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine, a country and a people with whom you share such deep ties of family, history, and culture. 77 years ago, our people fought and sacrificed side by side to end the worst war in history. World War II was a war of necessity. But if Russia attacks Ukraine, it would be a war of choice, or a war without cause or reason. I say these things not to provoke, but to speak the truth, because the truth matters. Accountability matters. If Russia does invade in the days and weeks ahead, the human cost for Ukraine will be immense. And the strategic cost for Russia will also be immense. If Russia attacks Ukraine, it'll be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound. The United States and our allies and partners will respond decisively. The West is united and galvanized. Today, our NATO allies and the alliance is as unified and determined as it has ever been. And the source of our unbreakable strength continues to be the power, resilience, and universal appeal of our shared democratic values. Because this is about more than just Russia and Ukraine. It's about standing for what we believe in, for the future we want for our world, for liberty, the right of countless countries to choose their own destiny, and the right of people to determine their own futures, for the principle that a country can't change its neighbor's borders by force. That's our vision. And toward that end, I'm confident that vision, that freedom will prevail. If Russia proceeds, we will rally the world to oppose its aggression. The United States and our allies and partners around the world are ready to impose powerful sanctions on export controls, including actions that we did not pursue when Russia invaded Crimea in eastern Ukraine in 2014. We put intense pressure on their largest and most significant financial institutions and key industries. These measures are ready to go as soon and if Russia moves. We'll impose long-term consequences that will undermine Russia's ability to compete economically and strategically. And when it comes to Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that would bring natural gas from Russia to Germany, if Russia further invades Ukraine, it will not happen. While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine, we have supplied the Ukrainian military with equipment to help them defend themselves. We provided training and advice and intelligence for the same purpose. And make no mistake, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. An attack against one NATO country is an attack against all of us. And the United States' commitment to Article 5 is sacrosanct. Two paths are still open. For the sake of historic responsibility, Russia and the United States share for global stability, for the sake of our common future, to choose diplomacy. But let there be no doubt. If Russia commits this breach by invading Ukraine, responsible nations around the world will not hesitate to respond. We do not stand for freedom where it is at risk today. We'll surely pay a steeper price tomorrow.
All right, so there you have it. Now, the obvious hypocrisies are clear when he says, like, we stand for liberty, the right of countries to choose their own destiny. And when he said that thing at the end there, that's just our talk. We don't really believe that. The United States arms and funds and props up 73% of the world's dictatorships. In the global south, we overthrow democratic governments all the time and put in our own puppet dictators. So this idea that, like, we're committed to human rights and democracy and nation sovereignty, it's just not true. Like, that's just factually wrong. And so, of course, it seems absurd when we lecture anybody else when they violate these things that are supposed to be norms and rules. Now, that doesn't mean it's okay when Russia does it. When Russia does it, it's bad too. Sovereign countries are sovereign and they should be respected as such. But this is part of the problem when you blow any legitimacy you have because you wantonly violate international law on a Tuesday before brunch. Your word doesn't carry any weight when you say this stuff. Now, hypocrisy never stopped the U.S. before. It's not going to stop us now. We're just going to plow forward and act like there is no hypocrisy. But look, outside of the obvious points here, what does Biden stress? Now, again, watch the whole clip because he says almost everything under the sun in regards to this conflict in a short 10 or 11-minute speech. But he leans on diplomacy and negotiation. He says the Russian people are not our enemy. He says the things that are on the table, sanction oligarchs. Actually, he might go a little further because he says sanction industry too. I would have no problem with sanctioning the oligarchs. Industry is a different question. That seems more broad than just the oligarchs. And once you do sanctions like that, you're going to hurt Russian civilians. And so I'm not okay at all with hurting Russian civilians. I am okay if Russia goes down this path of hurting the oligarchs. So there's a little bit of a distinction and a dichotomy there. I'm not sure exactly which path Biden would pick or how he would walk that line. But he says sanction industry. That's a little bit of an overreach. I would just say the oligarchs, if there's a way you can do it where you target the oligarchs without hurting the citizens. He brings up Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is an area where I agree with Biden. Trump actually was more hawkish on this and refused to approve the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is the Germany and Russia pipeline. Russia would send their natural gas to Germany. Trump was against it, which is kind of hilarious that he was called Putin's puppet since he was against that pipeline and wouldn't allow them to continue with it. Biden has allowed it, but he's saying, look, that's on the table. If you invade Ukraine, there is no more Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And it looks like he's going with an idea that I floated too, which is, not saying he got it from me, he didn't, but you basically sell U.S. natural gas to Germany at the same price they would have got from Russia, so you undercut them, and even if you sell it at a loss, okay, just subsidize it and call it a day. So it looks like that's on the table. He says, I'm not going to send American servicemen. That's contradictory. They are kind of sending American servicemen. They've already sent a couple thousand. Granted, you could say, given the scale of how many Russian troops were on the border, that's not that many, but, it is. He's not correct to say we're not sending American servicemen. I actually wouldn't send American servicemen. But then the other thing is, look, yes, if you arm Ukraine, that is viewed by Russia as an act of aggression by the West, and it's viewed as an offensive action from the West. But look, a sovereign country is a sovereign country, and if they want weapons nominally to defend themselves, you can't really oppose that. Now, there's a bigger problem, though, which is some percentage of the Ukrainian fighters are card-carrying neo-Nazis. The Azov Battalion, which is officially part of the Ukrainian government, which they admit up to, 20% of them are Nazis. I think the number is actually higher than that. That's just what they admit. And there was even a scandal over this in the U.S. about funding them, where we revoked their funding because they're Nazis, and then when nobody was looking, we allowed the funding to go back. So if you're going to arm them, which again, I understand a sovereign nation wanting to defend itself, you definitely can't arm the Nazis. Like, arming the Nazis is a bad idea, full stop. Don't arm Nazis. This shouldn't be controversial to say. Now, and then of course the other thing he says is, if Russia attacks NATO, it's on like Donkey Kong. So like, don't you dare attack any NATO country. Ukraine's not in NATO, so it's a little bit of a different story, which is one of the reasons why it's such a scandal. There's not as much of a united front in responding to it, but he says if you attack a NATO country, it's on like Donkey Kong. Okay, now, to get to the meat of the story, in my opinion, it's actually the media and the way the media has been acting in the West. It is the most abysmal display I've ever seen, probably since the build-up to the Iraq War. I think, honestly, what we've seen is even worse than Russiagate. It's even worse than pushing for the other interventions like in Libya and Syria. So, story the other day came out. Now we're talking, about a week ago or so. I think it was Bloomberg, maybe a couple others. They ran headlines. Russia is invading Ukraine. Like they're doing it now. Right now. Okay, They didn't. They didn't do it. Yes, there's a buildup of troops on the border. You can condemn that all you want. But they ran headlines and wrote articles saying Russia is currently invading Ukraine right now. You might want to be a little careful when we're dealing with a nuclear-armed power waging a war. And we're, of course, a nuclear-armed power, and there's like a proxy war going on with us, and you're just going to run the headline. You might want to fact-check that one, Dippy. You might want to make sure. Just double-check. Get a couple sources. Don't have anonymous sources for such things. But they just ran the headline. Russia is invading Ukraine. Are you kidding me? Now, you would think that after that incredible debacle, there were a number of outlets that ran that they'd be like, oh man, we got to reel it in a little bit, because this might be perceived as us spewing misinformation or disinformation. No, there's no accountability for the mainstream media outlets. You know this, I know this. They're viewed as definitionally trustworthy, even if they're objectively not. So then what happens? A few days after that, we get headlines. The invasion is going to happen on Wednesday. Wednesday as in today, the day I'm talking to you. What? Oh, the invasion is definitely happening Wednesday, and we know because the Ukrainian president said it. And so then all the headlines, so many media outlets ran with this one. Russia to invade Ukraine on Wednesday. Well, come to find out, it was a mistranslation. So the Ukrainian president was giving a speech and talking about the crisis, and he basically said, he made a joke, something along the lines of, well, the media is telling me that the invasion is going to happen Wednesday. All the idiot Western media outlets took it and ran with it as if it was factual and Russia was actually going to invade Ukraine on Wednesday. I cannot imagine a situation with higher stakes where you can't get it wrong and almost the entire media got it wrong. I can't imagine that. But they did. They got it wrong. Now, again, I want you to stop and think about this. All of the over-the-top outrage over Joe Rogan's use of the N-word in context, where he's talking about the word, not using the word and calling people the word. And, the prodding Spotify to, get him off your platform, get this guy out of the public consciousness, just ban him somehow, anyhow. Because look, he's spreading misinformation and disinformation, whether it's the N-word or the COVID vaccine stuff. These guys are playing fast and loose and reckless with war involving a nuclear-armed power. They're playing fast and loose and reckless with World War III. You cannot get something like that wrong. You just can't. The stakes are beyond high. Could you imagine if you're the reporter and you see the headline and you hear through the grapevine, oh, Russia's invading Ukraine. An anonymous source told me, or this thing told me. Wouldn't you pause a second and be like, well, I want to make sure I get this one right before I run the headline and write an article and make an ass of myself? They didn't think that way. Mainstream media didn't think that way because they have groupthink and all they do is conventional wisdom bullshit. And so that fits the narrative in the West of course, Russia bad, Russia evil, Russia terrible. And so they just ran it. Now, I would say it gets worse, but nothing is worse than getting this wrong. But there is something else that happened. Richard Engel of, I think it's NBC News, he did a piece, which was a total puff piece, on the Azov Battalion. Those people I just mentioned who are card-carrying neo-Nazis who are fighters for Ukraine. Look, I get it. I just told you it's a complex situation. A sovereign nation has a right to defend itself against an aggressor. So, of course, Ukraine has the right to have weapons and defend itself if Russia invades. Of course, absolutely. But that doesn't mean you get to do a puff piece on a neo-Nazi faction of the Ukrainian forces. And that's what they did. Now, you're telling me that's not misinformation and that's not disinformation to portray this group as, all puppies and rainbows and holding hands and singing Kumbaya and fighting the good fight? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? The number of ways in which the media has screwed this up is legendary. It's the worst I've seen since the Iraq War. It's worse than Russiagate. It's worse than Syria and Libya. They're just time after time after time, day after day, everything dead wrong. And like I said, nobody's going to stop and really digest this and understand, wow, the whole conversation about banning or censoring or deplatforming alternative and independent media outlets seems kind of silly now, doesn't it? Because I could do this show for 40 years and never get anything as wrong with as high of stakes and as high of consequences as these guys got wrong this week. All of the major outlets. So I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear the conversation anymore at all, ever, about like alternative media, new media, and independent media at all. They're problematic. Maybe we should bury them in the algorithm or censor them or deplatform them. Let's talk about this for 10 weeks straight. I don't want to hear it. The mainstream outlets are way, 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 way worse, and it's not even close. How do you get these things wrong as they have? It's unbelievable. Now, I want to end the segment with you, giving you what's actually going on in Russia and Ukraine at the moment, according to all the information that we have. So there's a guy by the name of Clint Ehrlich, and Clint Ehrlich he's been featured in Foreign Policy Magazine, Foreign Policy Magazine, Washington Post, Fox News, BBC, Dateline, NBC. He's a little bit of a heterodox voice on these issues, but he had a tweet thread on this which really caught my eye. It's interesting. It's interesting. It's thoughtful. So he says the following, and listen to every line here because I think it's all equally important. He says, "I'll put my reputation on the line. There is now zero chance that Russia suddenly invades Ukraine. It doesn't mean the crisis is over. Far from it. But the sudden invasion scenario is off the table. Here's why." He says, "Today, Russia claimed that it began withdrawing forces after the completion of drills around Ukraine. This has been disputed by NATO, who argues that the Russians have not meaningfully drawn down their troop numbers. In theory, a sudden attack remains viable. In reality, Russia's current expenditures of diplomatic capital make that implausible." Spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said today, quote, "Will go down in history as the day Western war propaganda failed." She said the West has been, quote, "shamed and destroyed without firing a single shot." So in other words, his argument, at least to this point, and we'll continue with the thread in a second, but his argument is like, what Russia did here, they claimed all along, like, this is just a defensive posture and we're just doing like our own war games because you guys keep doing war games on our border, so we're going to do the same, on the Ukrainian border. And basically Western media was baited into the sky is falling scenario, lying, getting things dead wrong, and Russia's basically doing a victory lap after that and saying, look at these guys. Look how warmongering they are and how hawkish they are, and they're destroying all their credibility. We didn't even have to fire a shot. That's what the Russian government is saying right now. They've been shamed and destroyed without firing a single shot. Many in the West will argue that Russia could still attack. This might all be a diversion, that the Russians could be pulling back only to get Ukraine to relax before a sudden attack. This fear overlooks the role of domestic politics and messaging in the Kremlin's decision-making. This is interesting. Previously, the best argument against Russia invading was that state media was not preparing the population for war. So there was no war fervor. There was no build-up to we have to do this in Russian media. Now we've gone a step further. Anti-preparation. We are no longer dealing with merely the absence of domestic propaganda. Instead, Russia is actively telling its own people that the projected invasion is all Western disinformation. The government will not be able to ask people to then support the very same invasion. Does that mean the threat is over? That Russia will definitely not invade Ukraine? No, not at all. Russia still has forces massed that are capable of executing the operation, but it would need a reason to justify the invasion. That won't happen today, which again, the day they told us is there's definitely going to be an invasion. It could happen in the coming days or weeks, but it won't be on the timeline that the West was projecting. There needs to be enough time for a provocation, likely in Donbass, to not only occur, but also to be publicized inside Russia. That is how you mobilize popular support. The message to justify a future invasion would go something like this. So this is, if there is going to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the following pieces would have to fall into place. This is the argument that the Russian government would make. They would say, look, we pulled back our forces from the border, and that only emboldened the West. They responded by attacking Russian citizens in eastern Ukraine, and now we have to respond to stop the genocide. because they refer to it as a genocide in the Donbass region. We've already seen clues pointing towards that approach. Today, even as he said that Russia does not want war, President Putin again labeled what is happening in the Donbass genocide. He blamed Ukraine for failing to honor the negotiated ceasefire. There was also just a 351-16 vote in the Duma requesting that Putin recognize the breakaway Donetsk and Lugansk republics. So far, he has resisted doing so, but it's a card he could play to bait Ukraine into launching an assault. That is a more plausible path to war. So do you understand all of that? I know it's a lot to digest. If you don't understand it, just click back in the video and watch it over again. But this is somebody who's clearly an expert and has a great understanding of the region and a great understanding of what would be necessary for war to happen. And he's saying, look, if there is going to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's not going to be a sudden one that just happens like this, because they sort of humiliated the West and Western media, showed how much disinformation and misinformation they spewed. And then what would happen now is if they pull back the troops, and look, it could come in the form of a false flag attack, or it could come in the form of a real attack where Putin says, hey, we turned around, we were withdrawing from the border, and then that only emboldened the West, and there were attacks against, our people, and so now we're gonna respond. But in order to do that, it would require, a media propaganda campaign to build up to war, the likes of which that we haven't seen yet to this point in Russia. Because they're saying, look, we defeated the West without firing a single shot. Look at how crazy these people are. Look at how hawkish they are. Look at how much they got everything dead wrong. So anyway, that's where we stand at the moment. And final point is this, and I actually think this is a really important point. So let's say, for argument's sake, nothing happens. And I'm not convinced of that. I don't know what's going to happen. I'll be the first to tell you, I have no idea what's going to happen. He invaded Georgia in the past. He invaded Crimea in the past. It's possible he invades Ukraine. Like, it is. I'm not one of the people who's like, he's definitely not going to do it. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. But for argument's sake here for a second, let's say it doesn't happen. Well, why ultimately would he have decided against it? Would Putin have decided against it? Well, there was a little discussed fact, news story that dropped the other day, which is the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, basically said more or less, and I'm paraphrasing here, look, maybe we don't end up joining NATO. Maybe that's just a pipe dream. Maybe, maybe we never become a part of NATO. And so remember, nominally, at least one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin was amassing troops on the border is because it's the old Cold War argument of like, Russia did not want NATO to move any closer to their border, and over the years, NATO has. And Russia views that as an act of aggression. And so they're saying, look, one of their demands is, don't you dare move NATO any closer to our border. It would be like if Russia put a big military base in Mexico right on the U.S. border. We would view that as an act of aggression. We would view that as offensive. We'd be like, what are you doing? So that's one of the main asks of Russia. If the Ukrainian president came out and said, all right, we're not going to join NATO, and then Russia pulls back, that's actually good evidence that that's at least one of the most important things that Russia really wanted, that they actually wanted that, and that was actually their main concern, that wasn't just a cover story for other nefarious motives. Now, again, I don't know. I don't know what the reality is. It's probably a complex, multifaceted situation, and there are a number of reasons why Russia's acting how they're acting, and a number of reasons why the West is acting how they're acting. But look, at the end of the day, the Ukrainian president says that, and then Russia draws down. Maybe we did avert the worst case scenario. Again, I don't know. I just read you that incredibly detailed thread, which says here's another way in which the war could happen, but it's not going to be a sudden invasion. It would require a series of events and a propaganda buildup to get us to that point where there is war. Okay. So there you have it, everybody. At least for the moment, the worst case scenario is averted. But the biggest takeaway from this segment is mainstream media in the West is absolute garbage. They're complete trash. And I think that's been made crystal clear in this segment. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.